Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience in getting in. As you know, there was a lot of interest and limited seating tonight, so I, again, appreciate you bearing with us. Thank you for being here for this special event featuring a conversation with Dr. Paul Farmer and Professor Roberto Goizueta. This evening's conversation will focus on the notion of accompaniment and how the preferential option for the poor and other aspects of liberation theology have impacted the lives of these two gentlemen and all the people that they affect. My name is Eric Goldschmidt. I'm the director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, and tonight's event is part of our C21 series on exploring the Catholic intellectual tradition. We are appreciative of our co-sponsors, the Theology Department, the School of Theology and Ministry, and the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. After a brief introduction, Dr. Farmer and Professor Goizueta will speak for about an hour. We will then open up the conversation to your questions for about 20 minutes or so. And what we'll do is we'll take questions in the middle there in between the sections. And then afterwards, I wanted to let you know that Dr. Farmer will be available in the lobby for conversation and signing of books, which you might have seen. We have his latest book that's coming out this month. So before we begin this event, we have Molly Newell to introduce this evening's speakers. Molly is a freshman in Lynch School of Education and part of the Shaw Leadership Program. She's close friends with Dr. Farmer, who has served as a mentor to her for much of her life. And let us welcome Molly.
Dr. Paul Farmer once said, "Every night when I go to bed, I worry about how I'll fulfill all the promises I've made. And every morning when I wake up, I think I haven't made enough promises." In their work and by their example, Paul Farmer and Roberto Goizueta both challenge us to ask, when we call ourselves Catholic Christians, what promises have we made to the poor and marginalized? What commitment have we made to our communities and to those communities that barely resemble our own? Both Farmer and Goizueta argue that the promise we must make is an all-consuming commitment. In order to live a truly Christian and moral life, we must promise to work on behalf of the poor and to accompany them in their struggles. We must create, as Jesus modeled for us in the Gospels, a preferential option for the poor. Professor Roberto Goizueta is the Margaret O'Brien Flatley Professor of Catholic Theology here at Boston College. Goizueta is a native of Cuba who studied at Yale and later went on to study systematic theology at Marquette University. In his seminal text, Caminemos con Jesús, or We Walk with Jesus, he asserts that our commitment to God and to our religion is the reason we should feel compelled to accompany the poor on their journey. He argues that if God is present preferentially among the poor, we can only know God if we place ourselves there also. The option for the poor is, then, the most important epistemological precondition for Christian faith. To know God, we must first opt for the poor. Dr. Farmer grew up in Central Florida, and he attended Duke University as an undergrad. He continued on to Harvard Medical School and received an MD, PhD in medical anthropology. Nearly 30 years ago, he went on to co-found the medical nonprofit Partners in Health in the Central Plateau of Haiti, whose mission statement is to provide a preferential option for the poor in healthcare. Having known Dr. Farmer since I was a little girl, it's been my privilege to work alongside him on several projects in Haiti for the past 5 years. Under Paul's guidance, I made a promise to the people of La Colline, Haiti, that I would help them to build a school in their village. I made a promise to accompany them on their journey. It's been a great privilege to get to know the children of La Colline and their parents, and to learn through personal experience that in order to effect true change, we must work with the poor, not for them. That by walking with the poor, we walk with Jesus. Dr. Farmer has said that to accompany someone is to go somewhere with him or her, to be present on a journey with a beginning and an end. I would like to thank him for modeling a life of true service for me and for everyone present here. I'd like to thank Professor Goizueta for sharing his wisdom and experience with us tonight. And thank you especially to Paul for accompanying me as I try to live out my Christian promise to opt for the poor. It is my honor to introduce to you Professor Roberto Goizueta and Dr. Paul Farmer.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you, Eric. Welcome, first of all, Paul. It's wonderful to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us here at BC, for doing us the honor of being present with us and joining us in this conversation.
But I would add at the beginning that I'm a little unhappy. I'd forgotten about the Yale connection.
Uh-oh. Oh, that's right. Right.
BC, man.
Go Bulldogs. But, Paul, to begin our conversation, what I'd like to do is to first ask you, I suspect that for a number of people, your connection with liberation theology is something that is not that well known. So maybe you could explain to us and tell us a little bit about your first encounters with liberation theology and how those encounters with liberation theology helped shape early on your own vocational discernment and career.
Well, you know, I always favor starting with the really easy questions, so I thank you. Really, put your guests at ease. You know, since the majority of people here are undergraduates, I'm happy to say that it was in college, really, and not so much growing up in a Catholic family, but in college, reading and taking a class. I took a class called medical anthropology. I didn't know what that was. I mean, had medical in it, sounded good. I was pre-med, biochemistry major. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of issues I really only dimly understood. The impact of large-scale social forces on the lives of people who everybody becomes a patient. In any case, at the same time, which was prehistoric to some of you here, in 1980 was when Archbishop Romero was killed in El Salvador. And the honesty of his analysis of what was happening in his country was very disturbing to me. And I still, didn't really make any connections, until I met, actually a friend of mine who's a nun is right here. I met a nun, a Catholic nun, working with migrant farm workers, and I was interested. I was writing about it, migrant farm workers, for a student publication at Duke. And I thought, wow, these are pretty different people from the ones I remember from church my church in Florida, where I grew up. The mean age of the parishioners was 174. And, we were just bored by it as kids. Anyway, I shouldn't say that. It sounds irreverent. I didn't mean it's irreverence. So it was really learning about how certain parts of the world worked. And then I went to Haiti after graduating and before I started medical school. And it was a way to understand the gravity of these lessons and these ideas, and to never be able to forget them. So that's kind of how it started for me, even before medical school.
Did your experience in Haiti?
What did you think? I learned it at Harvard?
No.
I love Harvard.
Hopefully not. Did your experience in Haiti change at all your understanding or appreciation of the church and the Catholicism that you had been raised?
Oh, very much so. In fact, during those years, just to be very technical about it, because you asked me about my experience, the year that I went there was 1983. In 1985, and I've got some friends who are graduates, including the graduate of BC High, BC, and BC Law, Brian Kincannon, who's somewhere here, wherever he is, there he is, who was in Haiti a decade after and still involved in Haiti. But I happened to go at the end of the family dictatorship. I didn't know that. Why would I know? It was 1983. In 1985, there was a great deal of tumult. Now, I had started medical school already, so I was kind of going back and forth between Harvard and Haiti. And It's not an easy commute in many ways. But
in many different ways.
These food riots, you've written about, and I'm allowed to interview you too, by the way.
Okay.
That's the game rules. But you've written about how you really don't understand these things from safe enclosures, I believe are your exact 2 words. And after being in Haiti, I didn't really, I didn't see why I shouldn't go back and forth between Haiti and Harvard. In fact, I was living at St. Mary of the Angels in Roxbury. A number of my friends from those years, still my friends, are here tonight. And in 1985, the dictatorship started to totter and fall, as such social arrangements often do. And I just happened to be there. In 1986, began, the dictatorship did fall. And, I've never seen such dramatic events in my life, which I then understood had been very sheltered, even though I didn't know that growing up in Florida. But I did then. And, I just stuck with it stuck with it because I met great people I was working with. And, I'm still lucky enough to work with many of those same people. Many of them have died, and not as many as one would hope from natural causes at a good old age, but rather died young of violence or structural violence. And, I've been obsessed with it ever since.
So what was it about that experience that most struck you, or that most challenged you, that you didn't expect in terms of the impact it had on you?
Well, I didn't really answer your last question.
That's what I was following up.
That's a good trick. They use that in psychiatry as well.
A leading question.
But one of the major forces for social justice in Haiti was the renascent liberation church, the Catholic Church. And I knew some of these people and became friends with many of them, and still am friends. Again, some of them have since died. And, just hearing about a preferential option for the poor as it was unrolling in these difficult circumstances was very moving to me. So really that was also, it could be that I'm here at BC talking to an eminent theologian and say, well, actually, Roberto, the most surprising thing to me was Catholic social teachings. But it's sort of true. And there were also some very painful moments for me and for the people I worked with. Again, many of whom died, or way too many to ever forget. And that was it was surprising in a different way, because in college or in books, I could read about the impact of this kind of structural violence or violence on people's lives that made them short and brutish. But being there in the middle of such social upheaval was in itself a surprise, even though not so much intellectually as affectively, as emotionally. It marked me very deeply.
Well, this preferential option for the poor that you write a great deal about is obviously central to liberation theology. Could you talk a little bit about how you understand the preferential option for the poor, and especially in your work in global health?
Well, in my work in global health, if I leave aside, the term global health didn't exist back then that I ever heard, right? And here, you could fill up an auditorium at BC with people interested in global health. But when we started having meetings of Harvard medical students, I started in the fall of '84, and we'd have meetings of people interested in international health, and 1 or 2 people would show up, 3 or 4. And it was really not a field that existed at that time. What I did study, in addition to my medical training in hospitals and clinical medicine, I studied epidemic disease. And so I said, wow, the microbes make a preferential option for the poor too. And, I didn't think that was some vastly witty or insightful conclusion. Any epidemiologist would tell you that. And they do go on and on about it, actually. I say that in the safe, what do you call it, safe enclosure, far from epidemiology. If there are any epidemiologists there. So in my own scholarly work, in medical anthropology, I did pursue that dream of doing both a medical degree and a PhD in anthropology. I started reading, in medicine and epidemiology and anthropology, and then I thought, wow, but the liberation theologians have some very powerful ideas that could help us understand not only epidemics, and again, I'm not talking about just epidemics of communicable disease, but epidemics of diabetes, for example, among Native Americans, or alcoholism in the beginning of the late 19th century and still afflicting Native Americans and other people marginalized by social forces well beyond their control. But it could also help us understand how to do medicine more effectively, whether you're talking about working in parts of Boston or in, now I'll think of some B places, Bhutan. How about Bhutan? Borneo, Brazil. In other words, everywhere. I've never been to Borneo, or Bhutan. I'm just saying, I've never been to a place where the idea of preferential options of the poor in healthcare was not illuminating or useful.
Mm. And what would you say for us?
Somebody laughed at the Borneo, Bhutan. Countries that begin with B.
What would you say are for us the biggest obstacles, you think, to the option for the poor? I mean, when you talk about a preferential option for the poor in this country, say, what for us do you think are the biggest barriers?
The biggest barriers to option for the poor in healthcare are all system barriers. They're systemic. So, that's an obvious thing to say. Even if you look at the writings of someone like Gustavo Gutierrez, when they talk about structural violence, it's violence that gets done to people who are marginalized by poverty and other social forces that is not always easy to see. How does racism get in the body? How does gender inequality get inside the bodies of people as pathology? And so those are system problems. Now, what about in other words, I'll just choose, I talked to, today I was talking to a student who's a nursing student here at BC, who's actually worked at Partners in Health. I don't know if Chloe's in here somewhere. I bet she is. Otherwise, she's never getting a job at Partners. And so she's working, at Healthcare for the Homeless now, had been in Haiti and elsewhere. And, how does homelessness happen? What are the lines along which it happens? How does it expose people to risk of bad outcomes? How does it, dissolve families? How is it related to mental illness? How is it related to the, unfair incarceration programs? How is it related to a shrinking economy or growing disparities? Those are really important things that we can learn about. And I think if you take those ideas of preferential options of the poor and say, how would they illuminate how better to serve people, you'd say, okay, where's the health system? So there's a system problem at the level of delivery. And again, these are problems that they're only just being studied now in medicine. What's our delivery platform, to use a term that gets used in information technology? When people from that part of the world talk about different cultures, Silicon Valley. When people from that part of the world talk about platforms, they mean communication platforms. But we can develop good systems to deliver healthcare for people who are marginalized by all these social forces and improve the outcomes for their health problems, like diabetes, major mental illness, AIDS, tuberculosis, chronic hepatitis C infection. The list is long. Right. So I think those are the biggest barriers. They're systems barriers that have their roots in history, in economic disparities, in rewards for, they're really sometimes called perverse incentives in economics. So I don't know much about economics, although that doesn't keep me from critiquing economics. But they're systems problems.
Right. you're currently
In other words, they're not volition problems.
Yeah.
They're not that people in this audience want to discriminate against poor people. They're not that Peruvian doctors and nurses want to discriminate against poor people, or that Haitian physicians or nurses. So that's the...
I think that's one of the important insights of liberation theology, is that a lot of the roots of injustice are really structural, systemic.
Exactly.
And that it doesn't mean that people are bad individuals per se, but we all participate in systems and structures that encourage certain forms of behavior and reward certain forms of behavior and discourage other forms of behavior. One of the things that you've been developing in terms of preferential option for the poor recently is you're writing a book on accompaniment as an aspect of preferential option for the poor. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you're implementing that notion in the work that you're doing? For example, in Chiapas.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm trying to learn to make a distinction between accompaniment in settings disrupted by structural violence and violence. You know, Peru at the tail end of a civil war and at the tail end of a cholera epidemic related to these large-scale social forces, at the beginning of an epidemic of drug-resistant tuberculosis, Guatemala and Chiapas in the midst of or at the end of turmoil, Haiti in the years that I described, Rwanda after a genocide, Siberia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those are a lot of the places that Partners in Health has worked in, and I've worked in all those places as well. So accompaniment is in part a notion to help improve, and this is a very pedestrian sounding idea, but to improve the quality of care that we can deliver as doctors or nurses, we have to be able to reach into the everyday lives of patients whose lives are already disrupted, I told you, by all these large-scale social forces that doctors and nurses aren't well trained to understand, much less remediate. So working with community health workers, you know, we call in Haiti acompañadores, promotores in a lot of Latin American countries. You know, it matters less what they are called and more what they do, which is reach into the everyday lives of people and help deliver something good. In my case, that often involves diagnosis and care for chronic disease, but one could imagine other models of accompaniment. At the other end of the spectrum, I would say, because that's the least we could do, I think, in medicine and nursing and psychology. There's a friend of mine who's a social psychologist here who would say the same thing and has written about it and teaches about it here at BC and thinking about other services. It seems to me that's the least we can do is figure out how to get it right, which we haven't done in the American healthcare system, as I've said. On the other end of the spectrum are people of, of influence and power who control a lot of the levers that could make this work for poor people a lot easier, a lot more difficult. Now, the accompaniment idea is not to leave behind the accompaniment of those living in poverty and suffering because of its effect on their lives, but rather to try and take those ideas to people who control extraordinary amounts of resources. I'll just give the example of so-called foreign aid. That's $150 billion worth of, again, the notion worth and cost, I could interrogate those all night too, but $150 billion of aid. And one of the questions that I would ask after 30 years of doing this work is, how do you make that not only less painful and ineffective, but better and more effective? The first place I went in Haiti was a squatter settlement of people who lost their land to a hydroelectric dam that was designed as a development project. And I bet people meant well, too. We needed electricity in Haiti. You need to improve agriculture, which means controlling irrigation. So that's, in my view, a very underappreciated form of accompaniment. You know, because if you just say, well, these people, as I'm sure all of you know, that's a reference to a great new movie. Never mind, I'll see if there are any. Some of my proteges are going to recognize that. What do you mean, you people? If you just assume that those people, powerful people, are not interested in improving the quality of our accompaniment for people living with, say, both poverty and disease. That's, of course, to make sure you don't have to do that more difficult form of accompaniment. It's a big mistake, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I remember the first time I met Gustavo Gutierrez. I was in graduate school at the time, and I was all excited. I was studying liberation theology. I was going to be a lay missionary in Latin America. I was going
It's not too late, right?
I know, no. Ask my wife. I think it is. He looked at me and he said, please don't come to Latin America. I mean, come and visit us and spend time with us, but we need you in the United States.
Yeah.
Bring back, our insights and liberation theology to the United States.
The man is wise. Unfortunately, I called him in an interview. He's like the Yoda of our time. And that's now appearing in a book that's too late to stop. It's already gone to press. He didn't know what I was talking about, really. Yoda, Star Wars. Anyway,
yeah, I'm sure.
We're talking about
I'm sure he didn't know.
Father Gustavo Gutierrez, who's in his mid-80s. But, why do you think someone like that went to Vatican II? Right. That's policy work in his church,
right,
in
exactly,
the church.
Exactly.
Right? Why would you go to Medellin or Puebla? So, to me, that's the same story. No wonder he said to you, you don't have to come here. Yeah. And that's what Romero said about military aid to El Salvador in 1979, 1980, until the day he was killed. Yeah. He said, these are not three worlds, first world, second world, third world, one world. And it's been a very challenging part of accompaniment for me.
But I do think that we need to break down a lot of the barriers that we have created. I think that's one of the issues and one of the key characteristics, I think, in the import of accompaniment as an understanding of liberation. That is, that I think that one of the major barriers to a preferential option for the poor is this kind of fundamental fear that we have of the other. Yeah. People on the other side of the border, on the other side of the railroad tracks, on the other side of the street. And we live in a society that promotes and encourages those kinds of separations and compartmentalization. And what I think is really important is for us to learn to make connections between what happens in Guatemala and what happens here, what happens in Bhutan and Rwanda and how we live here. And so the ability to cross borders and to meet people on the other side, as it were, is crucial. Gustavo likes to say that there can be no option for the poor without friendships with poor people. Otherwise, the poor become, you people, an abstraction. So how do we...
Tropic Thunder reference, I'm sure. That's the film.
That was the film that you watched. Yeah, so it's that kind of need to make connections, and I really think that we're afraid, and I think we're afraid of that because we like to think that we live in secure, safe, controlled enclosures, and that distinguishes us from those people who are powerless, who don't live in safety and security. And that's what I think we can learn from the others, is that in fact we're all in the same boat. In fact we're all ultimately powerless, and that's I think in the end that's what we're afraid of, is our own powerlessness ultimately, and so that's why we resist opening ourselves to others. And that's what I've learned from in my own work in communities of the poor, is that they ultimately reveal to me and remind me of the fact that we are all in God's hands, all of us. None of us is in complete control. And that ultimately is a liberating message, and that's, I think, what a lot of the poor have discovered, is the liberation implicit in that understanding that we're in God's hands.
And I think the other, and you've written about this in your work, the other thing about accompaniment in medicine, and again, every time I say medicine, I mean in healthcare delivery, so nurses, doctors, social workers, is it's really humbling. It's really it's upsetting. When they're talking about suffering, unmerited suffering is not a term that I found very useful. Unmerited, I mean suffering. I abuse the term all the time. But suffering is very humbling. And, you can imagine, I think anybody in this room could imagine what it might be like to be sick and alone and abandoned. And, because everybody has had an experience of not being sick and alone, but knowing someone who was sick, who they cared about. And that, bless you. And that is, that's my deep theology. But that's a very humbling thing because, medicine and even well-delivered medicine can do a lot. And there's almost no disease I can think of that should be called untreatable. You can always palliate suffering, but it is a very humbling thing to do. And it's been a great teacher in a way of the humility that ought to go with accompaniment.
Yeah.
It doesn't always go with accompaniment.
No.
And because it's just very hard for people to learn about other people, but to enter into the, Jim Keenan says that, right? That, some of these virtues that we extol, Father James Keenan, whether, compassion, mercy, it involves entering into the chaos of another person's life. And that's a very humbling thing to do and very disturbing, and to do it as a profession, like in medicine or nursing, or again, you go through the list. Practical theology, if I may, is it'll slap you down.
Yeah.
That's not Gustavo's term.
It's not a theological term. But I think, my experience has been that one of people's greatest fears is the fear or experience, too often, of invisibility and abandonment. Yeah. And the sense that I'm going through this alone. I think that is what can ultimately be debilitating. And I think that's my experience has been that being with and accompanying others in their own suffering, the technical term is compassion, not to suffer with, is in a sense the birthplace, the first experience of empowerment in one's own dignity. So that suffering that is shared is suffering that's already in retreat in some way. So that, if you will, the crucifixion and the resurrection are two sides of the same coin. And that in the midst of crucifixion, people can experience hope, can experience resurrection when we do it together. I think, and I had that experience a number of times. I remember returning to Cuba for the first time since I left with my family when I was a child. I returned about 7 years ago in a project with Catholic Charities. And very kind of anxious about how I was going to be received as a Cuban who had left the island. And when I returned, the message that I received over and over again from the people of the island was, thank you for not forgetting us. Because they feel forgotten, the people. And thank you for not forgetting us. I think that is the simple act of being with and of being present with people, I think is one of the ways in which we affirm the humanity of another person.
Amen.
Sermon over.
I don't know. I can't get too much of this stuff. I think it's very helpful, and I wish that a lot of people in my profession of medicine, and again, writ large, had access to or time to think about these matters. More and more time is being made for it, because it's it's inevitable if you're in these professions to be reminded of the need just to be present. In my line of work in infectious disease, and especially if you go to an area where a place where, let's just say there's some new treatment that would be available in Boston but not in rural Rwanda. I'll just give the example of rural Rwanda. We went there when I was there in 2004, and trying to bring some of my colleagues from Partners in Health, like Jack Connors, are here, trying to get my colleagues to sign up to work in Rwanda. which we did. When we went there to a rural area, there's just so much malaria, a lot of tuberculosis and AIDS in just those 3 illnesses alone. Bringing them under control allowed us to see just as dramatic, and there's a lot of other problems too, of course, but bringing some of those big problems under control: waterborne illness, vaccine-preventable illness, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, death during childbirth, bringing them under control, along obviously with the Rwandan system, again, the public health system that was being rebuilt, resulted in this fantastic, wonderful, miraculous, whatever the term may be, decline in mortality. In fact, we just reported, along with our colleagues, that these are the steepest declines in human mortality ever recorded. So imagine that. Yeah, imagine that. And I get choked up just thinking about it. Because to see that happen in less than 19 years, after the worst spasm of violence in Africa ever, to see that happen, see it charted, but that doesn't mean, of course, that people are not going to die one day. So far, as I've learned in my deep theological thinking, everybody dies at some point or another. And so suffering and losing people who you care about, who maybe they'll die, like my grandmother at 95. But that doesn't mean it's not suffering and painful. And so I think in medicine and like I said, in my line of work, you can see these miraculous declines because you're delivering, the standard of care in a place that has never had modern medicine. And the results are dramatic, especially if you get that delivery platform down. But doesn't mean that we're exempt from figuring out how to walk with people and our friends and family and our patients too.
To bring that conversation home, literally, could you talk a little about how colleges and universities what role they might play in the work that you're doing and the preferential option for the poor and delivering health globally?
Well, I can. In fact, it's the subject of the book that you just mentioned. No, I'm teasing. It is. I'm not teasing that it's a subject, but I've spent a lot of my time in the last decade thinking about this, in part because at Harvard, when I went through my medical training and started as a junior faculty member between the Brigham Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, I knew that I wanted to work with Partners in Health the rest of my life. And it didn't occur to me then that I would be able to become a professor at a university. And because I knew I would be in the field a lot, but what the field meant for me, then the Brigham, Haiti, the Brigham, Peru, the Brigham, Rwanda. And as the years went by and I was, kept on, promoted at a university, I saw more and more students there and elsewhere who were so deeply committed to this notion of global health equity, which, as I said, when I started medical school, may have had resonance for my classmates, but the field wasn't there. And now it's like a torrent of young, good torrent, not a bad torrent, of young Americans, I say Americans because we're sitting in said country, who are interested in equity, justice in a transnational, trans-regional way. So, I know you probably meant American universities and colleges, so I'll just say that there's a wellspring of goodwill. If that can be channeled into a social movement, and look at the social movements of the past, the civil rights movement in the United States, the fight against slavery that began first it began with the slaves, right? Not in the Britons and not in Britain and not in France and not in the United States. It was again from the bottom, from the oppressed, but it was echoed and amplified by people ordinary citizens, including young people in India. The fight for independence. Again, the big movements of, peaceful transition to full democracy with participation and with everyone, with basic social and rights for everyone, those required major social movements. Now, do we have that for health equity? Well, probably not, but it's great to see that there's so much energy in American universities and college for these global social justice issues. And then there are all the young people and students who don't get to go to college in Haiti, Rwanda, Malawi, go through the list. But they might, if they had universities that were open to them. In fact, they would, of course, I know that. I'd like to get them, make sure that they can be involved in being empowered to help to do better by their own, citizens in their own countries too. So I'm full of optimism about that. Harnessing it, harnessing this real energy is, I think, an important task for all of us lucky enough to be teachers.
And you talk about the students and the importance of a movement, a student movement for global health. What about institutionally, structurally, the universities themselves? Is there anything that they can...
Well, by my reckoning, again, as a serious student of social science, universities are created largely by humans. So I have to be optimistic. If you look at some work of like a sociologist like Pierre Bourdieu, who was a really great French sociologist, really worth remembering and reading. And he wrote, as do my teachers, because most of them are still with me, my teachers at Harvard. He wrote about social suffering. So if suffering has social origins and institutions have social origins, then why can't we change them to be the way that we want? Institutions always resist change. That's true of the Catholic Church. It's true of universities like BC, that there is resistance to change inside an institution, and those who study institutions know it to be true very broadly. But that doesn't mean they can't be changed. So I have optimism there too. What causes institutions to be reactionary and to change more slowly? Probably a lot of, when you have economic contracture, like economic crisis, that's when they become really reactionary and they circle the wagons, and just like the species does, our species, as opposed to some of the species I fight in my work against microbes. They probably circle the wagons too, but I'm not interested in the social psychology of microbes. But so that's why I think if we believe that students can be involved in movements, then why can't the administrators, the faculty, and when I say administrators, I mean the people who make up a university, the people who answer the phones, who keep the place clean, and it just seems the least we could do is to try.
Could you talk also a little bit about the various structural impediments and obstacles globally to global health delivery? Some of the things that you discuss in your book, Pathologies of Power.
Well, again, I think the biggest problems are systems problems, and it's very daunting, to face institutions that, as I said, are preserve privilege for some and deny privilege to others, that preserve access to the fruits of modernity for some, deny access to others. And I think if you look at most global institutions, again, if I say, okay, what's a global institution in 1600? There are global social institutions or translocal social institutions like slavery. It's an institution. The slave trade, it's not a natural institution that comes from bad weather or God. It's a social institution. You look at the Catholic Church. You look at, emerging, networks of merchants, whatever they may have been. Again, I'm not a historian of any century, including 1600. I don't know where that came from. I have a friend who's right here, a theologian named Jenny Block, who every time you ask her a question about theology, said, well, things changed a lot in the 4th century. So her obsession is the 4th century. In any case, if you look at global institutions then and global institutions now, for example, pick an institution that you want that's a trans-regional, NATO, a trade agreement that binds together people, a non-aligned movement. I think you could look at any or all of them. They're social institutions. Are they more resistant to progressive social change or less so? I think they're actually less resistant if we acknowledge our role in creating, sustaining, and replicating them. And so they're the biggest barriers. But are the biggest barriers because they're full of people who are against change, or are they the biggest barriers because that's the nature of institutions to be self-protecting? And, I don't have the answer to that question, but I see it all the time in benign organizations, let's say in a hospital where you divide into departments, or a university where you divide into departments. There's competition between them too. There's a lot of competition between institutions, people, NGOs, for example, and humanitarian work, when cooperation is what we need. And I've been humbled again by looking at this competition that leads us to add up to less than the sum of our parts. And I've been humbled because I say, wait, the people in those institutions are really nice people. And we've tried to make a self-critique of NGOs, not to criticize other NGOs, but to say, okay, how is it that you could have 10 NGOs and add up to the work of, say, 8? And I think that's a big challenge in human affairs. And it's going to require some systems change. Some of that system change will be driven by the way, by legislation. Again, back to, because my friend Jenny is sitting there, she said to me that almost every beneficial change for disabled people in this country came about through court injunction. Now, that's pretty disturbing. And, and I think there are a lot of good things that we can do and should do that involve, exhortation, bringing people on board, building up, improving our institutions. And some of them probably we're going to have to entrap ourselves into decency through rules, regulations, and changing the rules of the road. And I closed my eyes when I said it because it's not an obvious thing to say. I'll give one example. It's very expensive to give bad medical care to poor people in a rich country. It's expensive in terms of the cost in American emergency rooms, where you're delivering primary care through emergency rooms. It's expensive in outcomes. People who are vulnerable, don't have insurance, don't have social protection, safety net, they do less well than people who receive primary care from a clinic or at home. And when we talk about American healthcare lingo, when people talk about, in medicine, talk about the health home, the home where you get your health care, they still don't mean the home. They mean the clinic where you get your health care is your medical home. And we're saying, wait, your medical home should sometimes be your home. That's where you should get care for your chronic disease, like high blood pressure or some other. You shouldn't have to go to a clinic. Anyway, I probably went on a little bit long, but as you can see, I'm obsessed with the idea of how we can make institutions serve our species better, and particularly my constituents, poor people.
Right. One of the transnational organizations, I think you could say that you were talking about, one of those would be the church or churches. Yeah. Any role for the churches, or what have you seen in terms of your own work in places like Haiti?
Well, I've seen in my work, which I'm not. It's not that long. I mean, 30 years or so is not a long time to get to know something, alas. The good news is you guys, young people, you can master this stuff by the time you're 80, no problem. But I've seen in working in Latin America particularly, because Latin America is quite different in my experience from a lot of places in Africa where I've worked, which is Malawi, Rwanda, Lesotho. Not a lot, although I've spent a lot of the last 10 years in Rwanda. But the church is very different there. It's older. The Catholic Church, 1492 and on. And you can see places and times where the church has been a barrier to progressive change, and places where it's actually been the leading cheerleader and promoter of progressive social change. And the reason there is such variation is because, again, It's us humans who created it and staff it. That's a term that I'm sure Sister Catherine doesn't care for, staffing the church. And populate it. It is a human institution.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think theologians dispute that, right?
Right.
And so I think that the church can be an enormous force for social good, and should be, because that's in keeping with the Catholic social teaching that I'm familiar with or learning about.
Can you give some examples of that, of the
Yeah,
ways
sure
in
can.
which the church has been a force for good in Latin America?
Well, and again, inside one country, you're going to see various branches of the church. Like Haiti, just as there was a movement from the Liberation Church-based communities fighting for social justice, mostly rooted in poor communities, many of them urban, there was the contrapuntal reactionary force within the church. Same thing I saw in Guatemala. Same thing I saw in Peru. In Peru, just to give an example from a cholera epidemic in the 90s, is the church was very involved in community organizing in the places that I went, very involved. And in community organizing to do what? A, to make sure that people didn't die from cholera, which wasn't entirely the job of the Catholic Church. I don't see St. Peter writing about the church in cholera control. Thank you for laughing at that. You can't get a laugh at a university. So it's not like the early church leaders laid out the role of the church in infectious disease control. But what did they also do? They organized for public responses to more water and sanitation for poor communities in urban and then rural Peru. To me, that's an example of the church, the churches, which after all, to use the term of Penny Lernoux, church means the people of God, not just the institution, the hierarchy. That's what you've written this as too, I know. So I think those are just examples that wouldn't come to mind necessarily for a theologian, but if you're a doctor or a health worker in a setting like that, and you're waiting for the church to side with you against the pathogenic forces and pathogens, you got to go and say, hey, church people, help us out here. Help a brother out.
Have things changed at all in the last, 20, 30 years?
Well, again, if you start the clock when I did in 1980, personally, there was war and strife in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. Haiti would undergo a period of great tumult that still goes on. But yes, things are different. Peru, tail end of civil war, things are different. And there is a marked improvement in the overall health and social welfare of people in Latin America and people in poor parts of Latin America. The problem is inequality is also part of the challenge. It's like if everything is a little bit better for poor people, but a lot better for non-poor people, that's an equity challenge that I think that everybody has to struggle with. The Catholic Church has been very vocal about the problem of persistent poverty and rising inequality, and we should be, I believe. But there's a lot to be done to take on, and then globally, outside of Latin America, the world facts on poverty are still pretty disturbing, with huge numbers of people living on less than $1.25 a day, the figure that is used a lot in international development circles. And the reason that the MDGs, one of the main reasons the Millennium Development Goals have, there's a lot of forward movement. One of the reasons is China has lifted a lot of people out of poverty. That's one country. But there's a lot of problems inside China, a lot of growing inequalities, collapse of the rural health system, the rise of chronic diseases that affect primarily people living in poverty are uprooted by economic and social change. So again, I'm not going to say the poor will always be with us. It's been said before. But I am going to say that there's improvement, and that's a good thing. But there's a lot of structural violence and still a lot of violence in the world that I have to believe that if it's social suffering, then social action can undo it.
Talk a little bit about social suffering. That the term itself is probably not a term that most people are.
You're right. It isn't. And I'll tell you where I got it. In a way, like the term accompaniment, I actually learned that from the Haitians, not from a book, because they were always talking about it. And then I was reading the books and saying, "Wow, liberation theologians talk about that too." This was before you wrote your book, you see.
That's where I got it.
Structural violence, I pretty much heard it, hook, line, and sinker from the Haitians. They didn't use that term necessarily, but they did use terms like violence.
Right.
And so, a lot of notions I got from experience. And, what was your question again?
Could you talk a little bit about social suffering?
Oh, social suffering, yes, indeed. Don't get me going.
It's related to
So anyway, I was going back and forth to Harvard and Haiti, just to keep it short, but I think some of the students will be interested in this. My mentor at Harvard is and was a man named Arthur Kleinman, a physician anthropologist. He works in China, and he would talk a lot, as we would tell him, a lot and a lot and a lot about social suffering. And I got to write with him about this, as all his students did, and teach with him about it, which is a lot of fun. I even taught as a graduate student with him. And so we said, well, if you think of it as natural suffering, right, like a natural disaster, is really an earthquake in Haiti is a natural disaster? Well, if it's natural, then why would the same size earthquake in another place, very crowded, cause so many fewer deaths? Even that's not a natural disaster. It's a social disaster. And you look at gender disparity in, say, India, in a poor family. Well, that's not a natural disaster, as any post-feminist reading of suffering in India would tell you. So if they're not natural suffering that you're doomed to because you're human, what is it? Social suffering. The life expectancy at birth a few hundred years ago was all over the world probably about 25 years. Not too sharp, not too good. What's happening now is a massive increase in life expectancy all over the world. And that tells us that the suffering that happened before around disease, privation, want, violence, wasn't natural to our species. It was, now we're liberating ourselves or can liberate ourselves from a lot of social suffering. So anyway, that's where I got the term. I would welcome you to explore it. The students here, I've used it a lot in our work trying to understand structural violence.
I think we live in such an individualistic culture that the social anything becomes questioned. So I know that even the term social justice has been questioned by certain media pundits and others. But I think that in the Catholic tradition, certainly there's a sense of the person as inherently social. Yeah. And so everything we do has social implications, and we in turn are influenced by it. Well,
I know we're about to get the hook, but I would like to say one last thing. You can't see Roberto, but behind you looms Eric.
Oh, yeah.
Why would pundits... Bless you again. Now if any of you needs a chess film afterwards, I'll do it instead of book why would someone say, no, that's not social suffering, don't talk about social justice, don't talk about social anything? Because it leaves open the space that it may in fact be an accident, the hand of God, a biologically inherent outcome, or a natural disaster. Those are not true, they're false. They're social. So there's a reason people react to it negatively, and it has to do with established privilege and defending, structural violence in one way or the other. So, and it's no fun to be yelled at. Right. It's no fun to have people say, well, don't call it social justice, or don't talk about social suffering. I don't care for that either. But the good news is that it happens to be true. So, we have to push this forward, and including in places like universities.
Great. Thank you.
We're not done yet. Let's open it up to your questions. You'll see 2 microphones in the middle. and we can just take a minute.
I never thought I'd hear a doctor approve of social movements. Thank you very much for your support. In 2002 in El Salvador, the Marcha Blanca was 50,000 people of doctors and nurses and their whites coming out and joining all the people of El Salvador. I know doctors wash their hands a lot, and I just want to thank you with some homemade soap.
Thank you. Wow, thank you very much. Well, that's what we call pragmatic solidarity in my book. Thank you.
This question is for Dr. Farmer. Dr. Farmer, I wondered, as Partners in Health grows, I wonder what policies you all put in place or practices you emphasize so that there's a culture of accompaniment in the organization and that accompaniment is a reality there.
Well, it's a very difficult question because it's hard to put in place policies around some, just as it's hard to understand what theological disputes as rendered by the media are about. It's hard to know how to take an idea like that and make it into a policy, right? I hope that's fair. Some of the things you could do, and I'll be glad to share, and I have a number of colleagues here from Partners in Health tonight who would also be glad to talk to you. One of the things you could do is say, look, we're not in the business of short-term contractual arrangements. So if you go start working in Haiti, you wouldn't expect to say, okay, well, here is our metric by which we'll evaluate success and we'll determine whether or not we'll leave. Because accompaniment leads you to a different approach. It would lead you to build up sister organizations with local capacity that are capable of enduring as long as there is a need for preferential options for the poor in healthcare. So that's actually ends up having a lot of implications on management, program policies, budgets, assessments, how a board works. Another would be, okay, now that we've figured out that we believe in basic health rights, who confers rights? Do NGOs confer rights in the United States, Haiti, Rwanda, Russia? No. But the public sector does, right? If you have the right to primary education, it doesn't mean you have the right to go to Boston College. And so that leads to a different set of very difficult problems about how can we make sure that our expansion not only builds local capacity, which you can get by employing people from the places in which you're working, which is an important form of accompaniment, but also say, okay, how can we build a health system that will actually give poor people the right to health care, good health care? And I could go on, and believe me, I have. But there are ways, definitely, to make accompaniment part of the policies. And treating, I've already mentioned, in treating chronic disease, we use the term wraparound services. It's not a very good term. But it means that if people are hungry and sick, and you give them, let's say, treatment for a disease, but no way of allowing them to eat enough, then you're not doing accompaniment. And picking up on Roberto's book, if what you're doing does not cause anxiety, is not associated with churn and trouble, it's probably not accompaniment, because accompaniment is really hard to do. And I think we're learning all the time in our work in Partners in Health just how difficult it can be to try and move that into policies that would protect this work, especially in difficult times. Violence, war, big epidemics, and then contractures of budget. When you don't have enough money, we're socializing ourselves for scarcity, just as poor people are socialized for scarcity. It's extremely painful. And one of the ways to look at that honestly is to make sure that your coworkers not only learn from what they do, right? Because a lot of NGO work is not linked to learning, to discovering what it is you're doing or looking critically at the outcomes. Not only to learn what you do, to make sure and train others, especially the next generation, to take up the work, because that's another form of insurance against policies that really you may have inherited or just aren't good enough to move accompaniment forward. Thank you for that's a great question.
We'll take another couple questions. Yeah.
Dr. Farmer, this question is for you. I'm a nurse practitioner and medical anthropologist, and basically tried to copy you as best as I could. Now I work in a community health center on Cape Cod, and a lot of what you were talking about with the preferential option for the poor is what I thought I was getting into. But I feel like we run into barriers with such an entrenched system in the US for healthcare, kind of what you were saying about emergency room costs and the medical home. And I was wondering what you think, what small changes people like me and other nurses, physicians could make in community health that would start to change the system.
Well, it's a great question, and I would just say that if I had to choose one, how do we make sure that we can work with community health workers and value their work properly? It's been very difficult. One of my colleagues, who's a faculty member at Harvard Medical School and at the Brigham, Heidi Befferus, has worked on this for long years in neighborhoods around Boston. And it's just very difficult to do because our system isn't set up to support community health workers. It is set up to support, to some extent, doctors, nurse practitioners, right? But I think that's one thing that's within our reach. We're putting huge amounts of money as a nation, as a state, as a region, into healthcare delivery, more than any other country in the world. But we're not getting the return we want as far as value for that money goes. Just looking at value and looking at outcomes for the treatment, the diagnoses and treatments that we make, I think would lead us towards better community-based care. Not away from clinics like the one you work in, or the hospitals where I work, or clinics I work, not away from that, but towards that third part of the triangle, community-based care. That's just one thing our country needs very badly. Like I said, it's very expensive to give poor or mediocre medical care to poor people in a rich country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more question.
My question is from the theological perspective. I'm a student of theology from Brazil. So, what do you think?
Ready. One of the B's.
I remember when I was a student from Leonardo Boffi. He was my professor in Brazil. He was the most well-known liberation theologian. And he said when he came back from Germany, when he attended his doctorate, he went to work in Amazon. It's a very poor area in my country. And then he noted he should to change his theology and make another theology. And theology come from the poor, come from the people. Then begin liberation theology in Brazil, if another country in Latin America. So my question is, what do you think about the preferential option for the poor when this concept left his local place among the poor and became, in his local place, became among the scholar people? Because I feel this movement in my country, when the preferential option for the poor was among the poor and theologians were with the poor, this concept, it was very strong because it wasn't one concept, but a practice. And you can change my country, for example, change for the regime and change the dictatorship for a democratic country. Now, the option for the poor became a concept, and the poor people, it's like became object to receive this concept, but not make this concept working. So I just want to read what you think about that. The concept, preferential option for the poor, it's just now, I feel, among the scholars in academia, but far from the poor people.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And of course, that's the real, I mean, that's always a challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge. And that's essentially why I think the practice of accompaniment is essential. I think the point of the notion and of the practice of accompaniment is to insist that the preferential option for the poor is not a preferential option for a class of people. It's not a preferential option for a concept. It's a preferential option for poor persons. And that means that, that unless we engage with, or as Gustavo says, are friends with poor persons, that it will remain simply an academic concept. Now, the other side of that is that as theologians, I or Leonardo or any other liberation theologians have a responsibility to function as, to act as kind of a bridge between the community and the academy on the one hand and the larger church, I think, on the other. For the same reason that Paul acts as a bridge between Haiti and Harvard and you know, and Washington and et cetera. The danger, of course, is that you know, a bridge can collapse. But ultimately, I think you're absolutely right. Ultimately, that the people to whom we are accountable are the people in the community, the poor, the marginalized. Those are the ones to whom I ultimately, I think, am accountable. So no matter how coherent or ingenious or whatever my theological theories may be, if they don't respond to the reality and the needs of the people whom I claim to be in solidarity with, therefore, then they are necessarily fruitless and hypocritical and illusory, and I would argue even idolatrous. So that the notion of accompaniment tries to get at precisely the problem that you're suggesting, that the preferential option for the poor always has to be a practical option before it can be anything else.
I think that's a great question, and I'd just say, in a way, maybe a physician or a nurse who actually follows the burden of disease doesn't really have a choice. You know, if you're really drawn to that intersection of structural violence and personal experience of illness, right? It's hard. I mean, you can't be a doctor for poor people from an ivory tower because there's no clinical practice involved, you know, or right? So where'd you go, by the way? Brazilian guy? No, there you are. So
Connecticut.
You know, I don't. You know, you're in your little safe enclosure up there. I see. So you know, in medicine, that's what clinical practice is about. In nursing, I say medicine. And you know, I feel some sympathy for academics who can go to, and a great deal of admiration, you know, for an academic or a theologian who can write from a reserve about poor people, but he or she can't do that for long without the renewal of service and proximity, right? And you know, just you wouldn't be able to do it in medicine at all, right? Because you would not be able to understand why people were sick and how to diagnose them and how to make them better. So I say I feel some sympathy for those who try, but of course we're trying to have more sympathy, a lot more empathy, and a lot more solidarity with people who actually are poor and are being, you know, punished by poverty, racism, gender inequality, and other social forces that are created by us humans.
And I think we're going to end there. And before you all leave, I want to thank the people that helped make this successful before you all head out. Molly, thank you for starting us off. Rob Sham staff, thank you for making this work with us. Professor Goizueta, thank you for this idea. Thank you to our co-sponsors, and thank you all for coming this evening.